Welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Podcast. Joining me today is Tim Kelly. Tim Kelly and I are going to be discussing a alternative approach to strength and conditioning. We kind of dive deep into Tim's mind, how he works around programming, and we dive deep into what each day means. So the infamous Beaver Day, Cheetah Day, Rhino Day, Tiger Day, and so on that way. I really appreciate Tim's time. I really learned a lot from him, and I really appreciate his approach to things and the way he thinks. This is a real great episode, and I know you're going to love it. Before we get to the episode, though, I want to give a quick shout out to ISOFIT. ISOFIT is my go-to thing for all things isometric strength training and is a great way to help you win more and hurt less. ISOFIT is currently popping off, for lack of a better way to put it, in the sports performance world as 5 Division I NCAA teams added ISOFIT products to their strength and conditioning facilities, rehab facilities, so on that way over the last week alone, in addition to multiple professional teams. For more on ISOFIT, you can check the description below. Enjoy. Tim, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Dan. Like I said, I thank you for having me on, and I know you've had a lot of some of my kind of colleagues on as well. So, I was honored that you thought I was quality enough to be on your podcast. So, appreciate your time.
Yeah, for sure, man. Chip or Jeremy, that whole crew has told me so much about you. But for people who maybe haven't heard the same things about you, or maybe they don't know your backstory, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the great things that you've been doing?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Tim Kelly. I've been a strength and conditioning coach for the last 8 years. Before that, I was a collegiate athlete, and I do consider some of my time on the athlete side of strength and conditioning part of my experience as well, because I got to take it pretty seriously from a young age. I don't know if some of your listeners remember what velocity is, but that was kind of like the first big box sports performance facility, and that was my first exposure with it. So for 15 to 18 years, I've kind of lived in the performance world, either as an athlete and then also as a coach for the last 8 years. I obviously my first goal was to try to be a professional baseball player. And then along the way, I had an injury, and I learned a lot from that. And I think, like a lot of coaches, that's usually one of the catalysts that gets them into coaching, is to either A, help athletes with kind of preventative measures, B, just to be have a positive influence on the next generation, because the sports performance world and baseball did so much for me. I got a degree because of it and a pretty cool job after college. And that first one after college was at a facility called Virginia High Performance, which I got a fire hose and wealth of experience, which I'm forever grateful for. And for those of you that don't know what Virginia High Performance is, it's a local gym in Virginia Beach. The owner of it was a former Navy SEAL, and his daughter had played sports in the area when she was growing up. And he kind of started the facility to use his experience in the teams, which he also had a lot of human performance experience, and bring it into the private sector. And so, we were training with a lot of high school athletes, some college athletes, 1 or 2 pros here or there, and then obviously a lot of general population people. And then as I was there, the opportunity came along to work with some injured active duty military members, as well as retired veterans. And so that was being a younger strength conditioning coach, that was a huge life learning experience, and I'm forever grateful for it. I also started a family recently. I have 2 kids, one's 2, one's 1. So, the nature of that had me step away from VHP for a little bit. And I spent a year or 2 kind of just taking strength and conditioning more as a side project, so that way I could be there for my family and, manage our schedule, especially in the early years of having kids. And then now that my kids are a little bit older and in daycare and stuff like that, I've been able to work in the evenings at this facility in Williamsburg called the Williamsburg Indoor Sports Complex. And I've also done some basically substitute coaching at facilities like AIGA Sports and Beach Fitness and Performance, where I have good relationships with both of those coaches. So maybe you guys can get them on your podcast, because I certainly have stolen a lot of ideas from both of those gyms over the years. But that's pretty much my story, right? Is I've been an athlete and a coach for about 16 years, 8 years coaching. And I really just enjoy the field of sports performance a lot. And I hope we have some good things to talk about today. And I do sometimes come from a non-traditional lens, because I actually don't have an exercise science degree. When I transferred for baseball because of my arm injury, I was in an exercise science program, and then the school I ended up at, which was going to give me the most amount of money to play and the best opportunity to play as well. Didn't have an exercise science program, so I was like, I'm just going to get a basic, degree, and then I'll study all this stuff on my own time. So I took like kind of an easy major, and then was studying for the CSES and like doing basically almost like an interdisciplinary or self-led strength and conditioning curriculum, which is both a good and a bad thing. I think I've had that conversation with a lot of coaches who went through the collegiate channels, and there's positives on both sides. And so for me, it's always given me kind of just a different lens on how to look at strength and conditioning, since I didn't get kind of a structured curriculum, and I kind of pieced it together myself. And I still ended up getting my CSCS, because I had my bachelor's, but I didn't necessarily get college guided curriculum for strength and conditioning. So I got a lot more experience than textbook knowledge, and kind of almost did everything in reverse. Usually you get textbook knowledge and then you get experience. I kind of got experience and then learned textbook knowledge on the back end and tried to put them together.
Yeah, no, I love that unique upbringing and backstory. And I like how, like you said, you kind of think outside the box when it comes to strength and conditioning and training. I think that's absolutely essential. I think we've started to realize, like, hey, we've been using certain principles and certain approaches for a long time, and injury rates are climbing for some reason. So it's like maybe we need to rethink our approach. Maybe we need to be able to step back from what we've been doing, look at it through a different lens, and see what we've been missing. So I really like that kind of unique approach or unique perspective to things. And you mentioned, you had that injury when you were playing baseball, and it sounds like that really pushed you into what you're doing today. What did you end up injuring, and how did that really end up impacting you from a baseball career and then ultimately like a coaching and performance career?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a baseball player, we kind of always divide things into, your skill and your physicality. And because I got exposed to a sports performance at a young age, I had, head and shoulders above a lot of my peers' physicality because I had started it at a younger age. It wasn't necessarily that I was that much more genetically gifted. I mean, I do have, good genetics for sports. I'm 6'2" and 200 pounds, but I also worked at it from the time I was 12 years old. And that's kind of the thing I try to get across to the kids I work with today. I think at the time that I was coming up playing baseball in the early 2000s, Eric Cressey was just starting out, some of the big names in baseball, and that information wasn't, and Driveline wasn't even a thing yet, wasn't as easily accessible to the U.S. population of baseball players and athletes. And so a lot of the common knowledge from, the local coaches that had been passed down was like, you don't want to get too bulky. You didn't really want to train your upper body too much type of thing. And it was like more of like a fragile mindset is what I'll say. Not that they meant to do that, but it was kind of their common sense thinking because they didn't have the underlying principles of like strength and conditioning to kind of use that Socratic method or logical reasoning. And so I was doing the sports performance things. And I built a really big engine with like my lower half. Like I was squatting a lot and doing power cleans, and you kind of almost had like a football player lower body. But then like when it came time to do upper body, because of all of like the influence at a young age, and I didn't know what I was doing. I was like, okay, well I'll just throw and do maybe some push-ups and pull-ups and some light stuff, right? Which I basically created an imbalance. And then on top of the travel sports culture. In the South, it's warm pretty much year round. You play a lot of baseball. I played some other sports too, but I threw a lot. And I think that was one of the things that ended up creating an arm injury for me my senior year of high school, and then it kind of lingered through my sophomore, junior year of college because I basically had this overdeveloped physicality. I really wasn't that skilled of a baseball player. I was physical enough that it helped my skills get me to a Division I university. But being able to seek out really good skill development coaches, and the process of that has kind of been my project after getting out of baseball and trying to help the area with, where that was lagging when I was coming up. And so, missing out on that kind of development with the upper body has been something I've been able to give the next generation and create more of a resiliency or anti-fragile mindset around baseball. Things like bench press, weighted pull-ups, going heavy on your shoulder accessories like cuff exercises or planks or things like that. That wasn't the case when I was coming up playing, and I was also throwing too much. So just understanding periodization when it comes to baseball and methodologies, and then, kind of using just good basic strength and conditioning principles over a long period of time has been my goal, because in college I ended up having to kind of figure a lot of that stuff out for myself. And I think the main conversation that I've taken away, and I've said this in some other podcasts, was I ended up developing the yips towards the middle part of my shoulder injury because I had developed some capacity back, but I still didn't have a lot of those smaller, subtler, more specific principles to really get rid of the pain referencing, or like kind of the somatic, psychosomatic stuff with throwing. So I went from in high school throwing 90 miles an hour, maybe sometimes 92 miles an hour, to my first year of college, I was like throwing 80, 82 miles an hour. And it wasn't because I lost the capacity to throw that hard, but there's neurological guarding, there's muscular deficits, things like that. And I ended up working back up into the upper 80s and being able to get to 90 and stuff like that. But I was still having some pain. So I'd kind of fixed or addressed the capacity problem, but wasn't really having a lot of success with the pain issue. And it was still kind of before some of these baseball specific industries like driveline and tread athletics and all of these kind of hybrid strength and conditioning, baseball skill development things have come along. So I kind of had to do a lot of it myself. And that conversation I had with a psychologist called Dr. Richard Crowley, he helped me get rid of some of the pain I was experiencing using like a what's called corpus callosum cross bridging technique. So like the thing that syncs your left and right hemisphere. And the thing I took away from him is that all motor learning is done on the right hemisphere of your brain, which is like your creative side. And so when it comes to cueing, which I've taken as a coach now, I try not to really use too many cues. And when I do use cues, I use like metaphors, or I try to have an interactive dialogue with the athlete to use analogies and their imagination, because that's basically what he did to help me get rid of the yips. And for those of you who don't know what the yips is, it's basically a phenomenon where you lose the skill to throw a baseball. Sometimes it's purely psychological. Other times it's also physiological with like pain, and obviously a combination of that too. So it's both psychology and physiologically based. And so, if you're trying to change your arm slot because of pain, then you start thinking about it and you have these negative feedback loops. You kind of lose the neurological or motor skill of it. And so he had me do like these like kind of conversations with myself where you're using the right hemisphere brain. You think of a person, a place, or a thing, basically a noun, visualize it. And I used to visualize like this like character that I would draw when I was in like, lower school, like middle school and stuff like that. And I'd turn it into glass, and then he'd have me think of a situation with a coach or something that was like negative or not a good kind of social environment. And then like you basically go through the motion like physically. So I'd like have to go out into the cage by myself where I'm not going to like throw the ball into the stadium or something, and go through it really, really slow, almost like Tai Chi. That's kind of where I picked up an affinity for some Tai Chi as well. And then you would think about these things, you'd exhale and breathe, and you'd do it. And pretty much what you're doing is just neuromuscular re-education. And you're basically, as I've learned now, with kind of backfilling it with the exercise etymology or epistemology. I can't never remember which one is the word for words, right? But you're basically triangulating between proprioception, nociception, and interoception. And so those three is basically pain, right? How your body moves in space, and then how you coordinate your body internally in terms of sequencing and things like that. And so that technique that I learned from him, helped me finish college baseball without the yips and have a somewhat successful career. And then B, it was also like kind of the number one thing that got me into coaching. It was like, okay, like, that sucked to go through. I would like to help other people hopefully avoid what I had to go through. And that's kind of been why I've been doing strength and conditioning ever since. And I feel like a lot of coaches have similar situations. Either it was a performance issue, they weren't able to develop a certain amount of skill, or they lack some of the physical capacity to be a big leaguer or whatever. And there's a ton of stuff that goes into that, but generally speaking, skill and physicality. And then, they kind of find themselves in this field afterwards, which is not a bad thing. It's just, it tends to be the case. And so I think where you can go wrong with that is when you don't back it up with a good educational basis. And so you'll see a lot of former pro players or former college players that are relying purely on experience. And you can get by with that to a certain extent. But you kind of have to have this balance of really good foundational scientific principles and like an understanding of what you're doing, why you're doing it, how to do it. And then obviously the experience to apply it in your coaching situations, whether it's coaching baseball or coaching in the strength and conditioning sector, the private sports performance sector.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think you hit on so many amazing points there, Tim. To your point on interoception and nociception and so on that way, it is really incredible when you dive into the world of how the body perceives pain and how the body, perceives itself, really, for lack of a better way to put it, because these are things that we don't often think about. But the neuroscience of pain and the neurological side of movement is something that's really fascinating. That in itself could be its entire podcast.
Of
But
course.
I think that's something that, it's often overlooked. It's often forgotten about. A lot of times we think about movement and we think, okay, we need to beef this up. This needs to get stronger. Oh, well, you're not comfortable doing that yet. You just need to get stronger, do more. When in reality, sometimes it's a matter of addition by subtraction. Instead of loading it more, we have to actually just kind of focus in more on the movement pattern and almost persuade the body, like, hey, it's okay to do this again. I also love your point on the concept of strength and conditioning for baseball. I agree. I think that's come a long way. There are certainly still some instances where I see things and I'm like, yeah, I think we still have a ways to go. I'll distinctly remember there was a college I was involved with at one point, and the strength coach that this specific institution had for baseball had them starting their workouts with 4 sets of pull-ups and 4 sets of dips to failure
Oh,
in
Jesus.
season. And I was like, well, maybe in the off season that'd be great, a little
Yeah,
armor
exactly.
builder. But it first off, is there really ever off season for baseball? And second off, to your point too on throwing volumes and so on that way, kind of becomes a matter of how do we get people stronger, but keep the main thing the main thing. And in this case, the main thing would be sport. And I've noticed that you seem to post a lot about, it seems like your programming is almost based on like animal characteristics. I think I see tiger, rhino, and cheetah as the main three. And then every now and then, I think you post about taking like a beaver day, I think you call it. So walk
Yep.
me through kind of like animalistic approach to strength and conditioning. What exactly does each day mean? And then how do you apply it from a programming standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first backstory about me, before I ever got into baseball, I got into martial arts. So, the whole time that I was playing baseball, I also got into Taekwondo and then eventually like Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu. And particularly with Taekwondo, which is from Korea, they have the belt system, right? And so, it's like, especially someone that's like kind of more, what do they call it now? Neurodivergent or like ADHD, that's a whole different podcast too. But like basically your neurotype, like the way you learn and things like that, like the dopamine of like getting to a new level, almost like a video game. Like I got exposed to that very early on with martial arts. And I think it's a really good thing for any kid because it's a great structure or system to, teach them goal setting, discipline, their body, like the kind of interaction between their body and then their environment. And so, obviously at a young age, getting exposed to martial arts, I also always had an affinity for like, the more romanticized and like kind of esoteric martial arts, like you see like the Shaolin monks and like all of the stuff like on cartoons and things like that. And so like if you look at like these guys who were training, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, before the Western world even came in on them, they were studying animals. They're studying nature, which has a really naturally intelligent design that is very difficult to explain with words right now. Like when you're trying to explain hundreds and for some of the animals, thousands of years of evolution in an hour-long podcast. And so where I, would find pushback or kind of, so where I'm looking for, a slowing of understanding between me and the athlete is like, you're trying to use this term to set a goal for the day. And if you're a strength and conditioning coach, you understand block periodization, you understand daily undulating periodization, you understand methodologies, but the athlete does not. And so, there's a time and a place to do like true like macro block training where it's like, hey, this is our strength block. Hey, this is our hypertrophy block. Hey, this is our kind of speed or deload block where we're focusing more on sport performance, if you want to call it that. And instead of trying to do that over a multiple month period, because it's especially in the private sector, it's so hard to get kids consistently, like week to week even. Doing daily undulating periodization is a really great way to simplify methodologies and apply them in a context that is understandable to the athlete. Because they have eyes. They know what a rhino looks like. Like he's big, he's strong, he's not that fast, right? But he puts a lot of force into the ground, and he is also a lot of mass, so he's hard to move when it comes to opposing forces, right? So they get that. In strength and conditioning terms, rhino days are basically your 80% and above days, and your true like force development days on the force velocity curve, right? And so that's the easiest way to think about it. There's always some gray area here and there about how you go about it, but that's typically what I try to do. And if you see it in my post on Instagram, I usually do it with my training partner, Chase Kiriakou, who we also do a podcast with. And so it's just one of those things that becomes a very intuitive language. Like, oh, what day are we doing today? We're going to do Rhino Day. So it's like, within that, when you're first learning strength and conditioning, you need to be very basic and like start to learn the different ranges of each block, right? So like a strength block can have a little bit more reps in it, a little bit less percentage. And then you kind of peak that to your max, right? Not a lot of people max anymore because it really is, it takes away, for the athletes, it takes away time. It's a whole nother skill. Like learning to lift weights is its own sport in of itself. Strength and conditioning is borrowed from Olympic lifting and powerlifting for a long time. So our job as private facility practitioners is to expedite that process for them in a safe and effective manner. And so the easiest way to do that is Rhino days. And so a sample day of that for someone might be they come in, still do a general warm up, but we're going to keep everything very short, 3 to 5 seconds or less from an energy system window, and then also loaded if possible, if applicable, especially if they're already in the hormonal window. And then, that could be a loaded sprint. It could be a loaded jump. Keep it pretty simple, a loaded med ball throw or a heavier med ball throw on the force velocity continuum. And then you get to your basic lifts, right? There's nothing wrong with compound movements like squat, hinging, pressing, pulling, and just stay very specific, chasing intensity that day in the form of load, right? And not so much volume. Sometimes that can be interchangeable during your hypertrophy block for also volume, right? You forsake a little intensity for volume. And then the Tiger Day comes along, and that's kind of the main one we want as athletes, right? That's kind of, you think of like your football player, or like in baseball terms, that kind of 5-tool athlete. But it can apply to any sport. It's the best of both worlds, right? They're able to create a lot of force rapidly and work on the velocity side of the force velocity curve, but they're still tolerant to, some of that load and force, and it's just in the middle, right? So it's strength, speed. And then cheetah days, that's like all nervous system, and then also connective tissue days, right? So when people have the muscular versus elastic conversation, it definitely, contrast training works well up until a point, but as you want to go up the exponential curve of adaptations, like the better you get at something, the more effort it takes to get less of a percentage. And so that cheetah day needs to be truly a cheetah day. So no load almost at all, if very light load, and long rest periods. Like a cheetah's like sleeping in the plains, and then all of a sudden he's going 60 miles an hour after a gazelle, right? And so really treating the nervous system, electrically, in the sense that we're going to stay within that same kind of time parameter on the energy development. For me, that's like 10 seconds or less. Sometimes we'll get into 10 to 20 if we're in more of an off season, like acquisition block. But the whole idea is through, repetition of the right intensity is you're coaxing these elastic qualities from your training, right? And you're just maximizing whatever the athlete is, genetically disposed for, right? I'm not saying you can change tendon lengths or tendon structure or anything like that. Unless you're like one of those Russian researchers back from like the super training Soviet era, where they I remember reading about this boxer that they tried to change his Achilles length, and they Frankenstein his Achilles up higher, and it must have been awful. It didn't work, but it's people will try to kind of articulate that on social media. It's oh, you're making your tendon stronger. It's yeah, it doesn't quite work like that. You're making the muscles, which isometrically produce force as the tendon and all that stuff slides, right? That's the idea behind elasticity, is basically the synchronization and the parameters of what you're training is basically highlighting that, because you're removing junk volume and you're going after the parameters that allow for that to happen on the continuum of adaptation and recovery, right? And then to kind of round that off is, for training, as we use that exponential curve, the more you train and the better you get, the closer you get from your training floor to your training ceiling and potential, the harder it is to recover from, and the more effort it takes to make less of an adaptation. So, the way you build a foundation is what I call beaver day. So you got to be a busy beaver. So it's if you only go and train once a week and you train really hard, that's cool. But if you're not doing anything the rest of the day, like your body's homeostasis or its set point is a lot lower. So like a lot of times my off days are beaver days. Doesn't mean I do a bunch. And some people call this like an active recovery day. But to me, it's just a tolerance thing. So it's like every athlete should be able to, without a lot of pushback, be able to do some push-ups, some pull-ups, some holds, a little bit of light aerobic conditioning, preferably with breath constraints. And like I said, just be a busy beaver, right? So it's like I wake up first thing in the morning on a beaver day, I go outside, I do a couple of like jumping jacks, some stretches, and then from there I'm going to pick a couple holds, and then I'm going to do maybe a couple tempo sets of like some calisthenics, and then from there I have like a general minimal set point that I'll always do, and then I just try to add over time a little bit to that versus trying to chase intensity on that day. It's really, that's more of like my volume capacity building day.
I love the breakdown you just gave, Tim, and I will love the way that your head works around programming. And I think you might have mentioned this. I think you said you usually do like 1 day a week for your cheetah, rhino, and your tiger day. And then
Yep.
the beaver days are like 2 or 3 times in between, roughly.
Yeah, I mean, like for really active kids, like it probably only needs to be 1 time a week. But like as you become an adult and you're more set, you're not going through puberty and growing and recovering, I think you can do them every day. Like sometimes I'll even do some of that stuff on the days that I train rhino, cheetah, and tiger days. Just because you've already, when you're going through the puberty window, right? Like you'll see a lot of growth plate injuries in sport, right? And that's because their capacity doesn't meet the demand. And so if you try to build the capacity as you're experiencing capacity, it's going to cause issues. But if you're smart about it and you use that beaver day like intelligently, then you can increase their capacity so they avoid growth plate issues. But you do need to prioritize recovery the same way you prioritize intensity on all the other days. And that's the biggest conversation I have with my young athletes. And then, when you're an adult and like more of like a college or pro athlete, because you're not going to be pushing the intensity as much, because there's a certain point, an inflection point, where you're not chasing adaptation anymore. You're trying to maintain your peak more than anything. And then, that's where the beaver day comes in as like a body management tool, a workload management tool. But all it is strength and conditioning methodologies that you're manipulating the program, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And the way you're outlining your own kind of routine on those days too, it sounds like a little bit of more like GPP focus and just kind of like a process of building someone who moves better, which I think is absolutely essential.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the Soviet research in the past. I forget what book it was by Pavel, but he had written one book that I remember reading where he talked about this individual in Soviet era Russia who their like exercise routine was basically GPP 30 to 45 minutes a day and move every joint through its full available range over and over and over again. And the dude was an absolute tank from a performance standpoint. And it's like, it's such a simple concept, and yet we just forget about it all the time in favor of, well, we need to load people heavier, we need to push more, we need to do more. And it's like sometimes that low-hanging fruit that we often forget about offers us a huge bang for our buck. I also like the concept of, again, going back to cheetah, rhino, and tiger days. It really breaks things down really nice in the sense of you need those high force days at least 1 time per week from what the research is showing to actually make notable strength gains. And as you said, we do need to have a strength stimulus in our training. We can't, in my opinion, GPP is great to the point I just made, but GPP alone cannot get you to the peak performance. We have to move the needle forward, and we actually have to load the system progressively. So I love the concept of having that rhino day, that high force day to do that. And then I like how you kind of have on either end of that spectrum, right? So if rhino day is, I'm thinking like your high force, as you mentioned, the 80 to 90%, 1 rep max type ranges. Then from there, you go high force, high velocity, and high force, low velocity between tiger and cheetah, or low force, high velocity, I should say. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I like how you're basically manipulating the load and manipulating the velocity of the movement accordingly on those other days. And I think that those days can provide such a great training stimulus realistically. across the spectrum of athletes, not just baseball, but, if I think about like sprints or, even just sprinting to top speed, like you might do on a cheetah day, for example, that is such a powerful stimulus. That is such a lot of, it's a high velocity, but it's also a lot of force through the system. And a lot of times we forget just how powerful sprinting alone by itself can be because we're so caught up in the minutia that we do in the weight room.
Yeah, and one of the things I try to phrase it for athletes is like the body is a system of systems. It's always going to use all the systems all the time, but by from our kind of conscious perspective, putting these kind of priorities in place, you're going to prioritize a certain system. And so, if you had to put the systems to each day, is we're going to put the skeletal and the musculoskeletal system on the rhino day. So those are the adaptations we're trying to get mostly through Wolff's law, sometimes Davis's law, right? And then on the tiger day, we're looking at more of the nervous system and the musculoskeletal system and how they work together. And then on the cheetah day, we're looking at truly the nervous system. And then even too, you could argue basically the fascia or lymphatic system. And then on the beaver day is truly the lymphatic system and the digestive system and the endocrine system, because you're recovering all of those things. And to move, like in order to get better joint articulation, you have to move in order to move the lymph through the body and basically get better interstitial fluid quality in terms of how the actual tissue slides. And so, like you said, that movement quality, building a better mover on the beaver day, like that's exactly the point. It's just a movement day. With the idea of, if you're consistent enough with it, then you need less of that over time, because you're kind of highlighting each system in the order it should go. So that way you're prioritizing recovery, but then also prioritizing adaptation. Not to say you can't do some of those things by crossing systems. It's probably going to happen slower. It's going to be harder to recover from. It's going to be harder to be optimal in terms of results, but it can be done. And people have shown that. It's just, I find it simpler to bifurcate everything.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And on that concept of systems theory for a second, on one hand, it's essential to understand the human body and various systems within it, right? Nervous system, muscular system, everything that you just outlined. But the same thing is true from a training standpoint as well, right? Like it sounds like in your mind, you're thinking about your programming in terms of tiger, cheetah, rhino, beaver days. But someone else might think of it entirely differently. And, there's not one right or wrong way to program. It's really an art. And that's what I love about it so much. But I've seen a lot of, early on younger students, strength coaches, trainers, that sort of thing. And maybe I've been guilty of it myself when I started personal training back in the day as well. It's like we almost just kind of slap programs together because it's like, well, this looks cool, or this will be good, or, I need more quad strength, so this is a good enough quad exercise or something that way. And it's one of those things that I found the more you actually develop a methodology to what you do and why you do and develop a deeper rationale behind it, the better the outcome is going to be for the athlete, but also for you as a coach, because now you're actually learning from what you're doing and you're able to take that process and repeat it over and over and over again, refine it, evolve it, and change it over time. It's one of those things. I think Stu McMillan had a quote recently, and I'm going to paraphrase it, about how we're always looking for the simplest solution to the complex problem. But, perhaps maybe instead we need to look at the complex problem as the fact it's complex and not try and simplify it too much, but actually meet it where it's at.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I've also worked with a very wide range of ages. So I've gotten to, through trial and error, and I'll obviously say I wasn't always right with what I was doing. And probably won't think that 3 years from now when I'm looking back at what I'm doing now, kind of take what that concept you say and apply it to different age demographics. And so, what may not work for a 20-year-old college baseball player or college football player might be the perfect thing for a 10 or 12-year-old who's just getting into strength and conditioning for the first time. And that kind of idea of mastery and taking the methodologies in of themselves as their own digestible learning material is kind of how I try to approach it now with my younger athletes, which is why I've gravitated towards the actual animalistic days. Because remember, I said I learned early on that movement is learned in the right side of the brain, the creative side of the brain. So analogies and metaphors resonate with someone who has no context of what any of the methodologies, periodization, exercise, anatomy, and physiology is. And I think it helps them internalize it, because they're always on a continuum. And, that continuum is external motivation into internal motivation. And that changes over time as you age and get farther along the mastery of a certain sport. But also it changes even once you master a sport. People go through phases of they're more motivated and less motivated too. And so being able to kind of empower the athlete and create a sense of autonomy by educating as well has been something I've really tried to lean into. And being transparent, like, hey, I don't know everything. Like, these are just things I've learned. This is how I package them in a way that is digestible for everybody to understand. And then let's try together, right? And so, one of the biggest studies that I read a long time ago, and I had to do it because of necessity. I think one of the things that one of my Virginia high performance days is I worked with a lot of athletes with neurological injuries. So my one friend who I played baseball with had a spinal cord injury. I had, over the years, helped him get back to walking again. He's still not where he wants to be, but it's been a tremendous process to see him go from not being able to walk to now he can walk with braces and a walker. Same thing with a couple of the other military guys that I worked with. There was one guy who'd gotten in a bike accident, same spinal cord injury. He could walk, but he had, he couldn't ride his bike. He couldn't do certain things. By the time he was done at VHP, he could ride his bike again, right? So to me, it's always about that kind of external to internal motivation. And then the study that I was talking about a few seconds ago was done by Wolf and Luthwaite. I always cite it because it kind of encapsulates training in its entirety. And it was the theory of motor learning. And so basically what they did is they set up a bunch of different things, and without getting too much into the science of it, the general consensus is through goal action coupling and the task of the environment, you either have a vicious or virtuous cycle. And so the vicious cycle is when the task or the cue was an internal dialogue, and they weren't acting in their environment appropriately. They didn't demonstrate any kind of motor learning. Whereas the virtuous cycle was when there was a certain task for the goal action coupling with motor learning that was asked of them. And they always, when they went and tested it again later against the control group, showed, improvement in the motor learning, right? And so basically what that told me once I read that study is, regardless of whether you're in the physical therapy setting or the strength and conditioning setting, we're both environmental manipulators, right? And you just have to have enough understanding of the organism to know what continuum that person you're working with is on. Are they more in the internal spectrum, or are they more on the external motivation spectrum? And then how do I go about setting that environment? And after a certain point, you can weaponize the vicious cycle and have less and less of those to create a influx of more virtuous cycles with the training process, right? But that, if you're a strength and conditioning coach and you want to learn more about the hard science of constraints-based approach, that study is one I would start with, because it definitely did a lot for me in my coaching lens and ideologies and things like that.
And as you mentioned, and as we were talking, again, it's something that's a little more complex than we often think about at first. So being able to dive into those more complex concepts can really make a difference, in my opinion, from just overall depth of knowledge and understanding about what we're doing and why we're doing it, but also the impact that we can have on someone, in regardless of setting, right? As you mentioned, PT, strength coach, AT, chiro, whatever kind of setting, whether it's, post ortho injury, no injury, post neurologic injury, exercise is a very powerful tool. But again, it's a wide array of toolboxes that we have to choose from. So it's a matter of, what tool do I use? How do I use it? How do I apply it? And how do I use it to the point where it's effective, but not too much to the point of detriment, right? Like, I like to think about the dosing here as we think about pharmaceutical agents, for lack of a better way to put it. We have a therapeutic window. We have to do enough to cause some kind of effect. But if we do too much, we start to get detrimental effect. As you talked about earlier with baseball, a lot of times we get a lot of high volume throwing, and it's a matter of, we need to do enough strengthening and enough in the gym to support that. But if we go overboard, maybe we start to see, some of the performance drop or injury or so on that way. And I think the more we understand exercise, the more we understand progressions, the more we understand these things from a deeper level, the better we are at that. So with that in mind, how do you go about, from your cheetah, rhino, and tiger days, how do you go about progressing them over time throughout your program? and overall structure to those days, what do they look like, right? Like, to me, if a rhino day is really heavy, if it's like a heavy squat, heavy RDL, and maybe like some heavy overhead press and that sort of thing, to me, that's going to be a very CNS taxing type day. And I might personally look to put one of the easier beaver type days or something like that afterwards in my programming. So how do you go about programming those on your side of things? What do the actual sessions themselves look like? And how do you go about progressing them in the future?
Yeah, and again, just like any good strength and conditioning coach, it goes on a needs analysis basis. So, for me, like I've been posting that stuff because my training partner Chase and we're a little more on the advanced training age side of things. If you're using the belt system, like we're more towards the red, purple, or black belt on certain exercises in terms of how I've kind of systemized them. So, we can get away with daily undulating periodization because we're not really competing for anything specific anymore. So it's not that we're necessarily chasing adaptations. We're trying to maximize basically our overall health and just kind of resiliency. So I think that methodology is a great approach to the general population as well, because unless they explicitly state that they have a hobby or pursuit where they're like, hey, I want to do a powerlifting competition, or I want to do a marathon, or whatever that particular personal pursuit is that you're going to prioritize on their needs analysis, it's a great way to just make them more well-rounded as an organism, and just that's where the benefit is from, is the ability to tolerate extremes. And that's the thing we see in the elderly population, is that's why they start to have issues, is that they can't tolerate extremes anymore. And I can't remember the name of this study like the other one, but I remember reading this one early on too. It was a meta-analysis and a longitudinal study, and they took like these people that were reaching basically retirement age, like 65, to collect their Social Security, and they did a 20-year study on them, and they had them do a wide variety of tests, some physical, some psychological, social. Like I said, it was a big study. But the part that I gravitated towards in the study was the physical part, obviously. And the three things that I remember from it was a touch point test. So how many touch points did it take to stand up off of the ground? So that's kind of like your general mobility and tissue quality, as well as like just your strength as well. It was like ankle dorsiflexion and jump height. And so, and for people that couldn't do jump height, it was like a leg press, like, equivalent type of thing. So like force output, basically, right? And the people that scored the highest on all three of those, right, one of the ways they kind of categorized it were some of the same people that were A, still alive in all-cause mortality, and B, also still living independently, and they weren't in a nursing home and things like that. So it's like, to me, right, you're talking about basically those three things are the beaver day, the rhino day, and either tiger or cheater day. So it's like, why wouldn't you want the general population to have a wide variety of these extremes when the goal is to live a quality life, not necessarily a long life? Because you can live long and have low quality of life. We've seen that with some of the science and data and stuff like that. So it's like, if you can extrapolate all of this complicated information into a very digestible term, which is people understand animals and analogies, they're a lot more likely or suggestible to follow it, right? And they're like, I can do that. I can do a rhino day once a week. I can do a tiger day once a week. And it makes it easier to recover from too, I found. So unless you're specifically have a long-term athletic development plan, I think daily undulating periodization, and you can at a certain point go off of auto-regulation with that. So, if you go kind of the way we usually do it is we'll do tiger day first because you're the freshest. That's the one that we want to hit, the heaviest number on like a power clean or a depth drop into a broad jump, a loaded sprint. That's to me, as you get older, is probably going to be the hardest thing on the nervous system. Once you're a trained athlete, if you're not a trained athlete, then the rhino is, obviously, because that's going to be really taxing on your nervous system and your connective tissue. But usually we go tiger, and then we go rhino, and then we'll do cheetah, and then beaver days in between. And that's usually with a day in between each one of those, sometimes back to back. But then sometimes too, like the same way you periodize certain blocks, like a hypertrophy block or a strength block or a power and speed block. We just manipulate our rep ranges and durations and volumes to fit that within each day. And then from there, sometimes we'll do, like a cheetah, tiger, cheetah, right? And no beaver days, because we want to be kind of as fresh as possible. So we're just enjoying life outside of that, right? Whereas if I'm working with these young athletes, I might actually take a rhino block and have them do that, because I only see them once a week sometimes, or twice a week. And I'll have them do that for 6 weeks. You know what I mean? And sometimes I don't even get into the tiger stuff with them until they've done, 3 to 6 months of rhino and cheetah training, right? So in my facility, I think it's okay to mix some of those modalities. So they get all their cheetah training in the front half of the class, which is, a group warm up where you're doing like mirror drills, coordination drills with a tennis ball. And like basically, so I call it patterning. So they have like a lower body pattern and a hand pattern. So they'll do like side shuffles and taking the ball around their body for proprioception and hand-eye coordination. They'll toss them in the air. They'll bounce them off the ground. From there, I'll have them do it where they rotate or spin, or I'll have them do a karaoke pattern, basically adding complexity to that. So that way we're trying to kind of highlight the vestibular system. And at the same time, it's a good warm up because you're asking more cognitively, which is going to increase the energy demands too. Because remember the brain uses a ton of glycogen. And so sport is problem solving under constraints, right? So if I can give that to every kid, it's just going to help them be more engaged and be more resilient. From there, I kind of actually front load the accessory exercises because in my experience, most athletes, when you get to the accessory exercises, they're uninterested and they don't do them hard enough. So I keep the volume on the accessory exercises wicked low and super intense. And so we just call it hips core balance. And so, we'll pick something from, sometimes it's a foot exercise too, but something from like the hip, flexion, extension, rotation, playbook. And we do like basically just 2 sets of it. Right. And the goal is to maximize the movement quality of it. And then the load you can do it at for the certain, rep constraint. And I just rotate that through the months. Same thing with core exercises. Those are usually holds. Sometimes they're dynamic core exercises. And then usually the balance part is some kind of foot ankle exercise. And so we're hitting all that stuff on the front end. I also find it's a good potentiator for the rest of the cheetah part of class, which is plyometric speed agility. From there, we're doing like true plyometrics and involuntary contractions, so depth drops and, reactive jumps, things like that. And I rotate the parameter from a cardinal plane pattern every 3 weeks. So it's mostly linear and vertical stuff the first week, acceleration focus. Second week is mostly frontal plane and change of direction type stuff the second week. And then the last week is usually top speed. Sometimes we'll also add in torque is what I call it. So as much rotational add-ons as we can to certain exercises just to have the organism have to deal with basically the magnitude of force, which is torque, right? So if you have an athlete do a full speed sprint and they have to rotate at the same time, you're putting a ton of torque on the foot and ankle joint. Plus kids think it's fun. I call them snowboard jumps, right? So they run as fast as they can. They run and jump and take off and try to do as many spins as they can. Because they're younger, right? That's not something I would necessarily do with like a pro athlete because you got to manage soft tissue stuff. But kids can't produce enough force really yet to hurt themselves. So you're in the developmental window where their soft tissue is kind of being influenced by their environment. So if I can give them a wider variety of cues and environment to pull from, it's going to benefit them later on. So my goal as a strength coach is to have the person I hand them off to thank me for doing, a good job so they don't have to teach them as much and they're just more resilient. And then, once they finish their plyometrics, that speed and agility portion, that is always off of a energy system constraint. So, it basically off of that 3-week periodization model, it's very, very short, 3 to 5 seconds and then 5 to 10 seconds. And then based off their sport, I'll usually go in the 10 to 15 or 15 to 30 second window on some of the agility games. And I really do try to make it game led in the agility sector, because not that I have anything against agility ladders. I do use them sometimes and things like that. But, I try to only use choreographed agility patterns as a teaching point. And then from there, I just want them to integrate it back into an open-ended, chaotic environment. And so that's kind of how I fit cheetah days into rhino days. So they basically all do cheetah days on the front end and a little bit of baby rhino stuff for 3 to 6 weeks at a time. As they graduate in proficiency and training age, I'll mix in tiger days and then maybe start having them do actual daily or weekly undulating periodization from the lifting perspective.
I love that concept of microdosing the cheetah day into the rhino day. And I also really love that concept too of almost a more freestyle approach to agility and so on that way. I find a lot of times we put a lot of constraints up, or we limit athletes to a certain pattern, and we try and do that to get certain carryover to sport or activity or whatever we're kind of training for. And I look at what we're doing, and then I look at, watch a game or something like that. And I realize the athlete might have done that once in that entire game, right? And then they use all these other patterns that we never actually trained or never actually got to because we didn't allow enough freedom of movement. And I think your point too on the youth side is absolutely essential too, is the more we expose them to a wide array of movements, so expanding that movement vocabulary or movement IQ, I like to call it, early on, the better they're going to be long term, because it's like, hey, I've already done hundreds or thousands of repetitions through this pattern because I've been exposed to so much of that stimulus as I was growing up, as I was developing, and so on that way. So I certainly think that's an essential element. And I love how you kind of tie in and bring all those other pieces, such as the neural side of things, back into this as well. I think proprioceptive training is often forgotten about completely or done incorrectly. I've seen a lot of people posting these like single leg balance exercises.
Yeah.
People are standing on blue foam or some kind of soft surface, that way, a compliant surface. And they're like, yeah, we're training proprioception. And I'm always kind of baffled by it because I believe proprioception is our ability to detect where we are in space. So if we constantly are moving and can't feel the ground underneath us, then how are we improving our ability to detect where we are? So it's certainly one of those things that I feel like the concepts are essential, but a lot of trainers, coaches, PTs, we often misunderstand or misinterpret the concept. So I think that really bringing those things full circle into an approach like this that hammers everything from that deeper level is absolutely essential. I like the way your head thinks. I like the way you program. One of the things I always see you saying as well, Tim, is you're always telling people to feed the wolf. And I have a general idea of what I think that means, but what does it mean to you to feed the wolf when it comes to training?
Yeah, when I started my business, right, my name of my business, all that stuff is I wanted to make it wide reaching and not about myself. Nothing against coaches that name their system after themselves. I don't think that's a bad thing inherently. But ideally, I'd like just the concept of strength and conditioning to kind of be there available to anybody that wants to use them. And then I'm kind of more of a librarian, or the other analogy I'll use is like a Sherpa, right? So like I literally experience what these kids are going through. So they, I was them. I started at 10 or 12 years old doing some kind of training. And then, I went all the way up to the mountain, right? It started off, the picture I'll draw them is like, they're in a boat. They'll arrive on a distant shore. They go through a grassy, fun, playful field. Then the mountains start to get a little bigger, a little harder. They're not trained to do it. And eventually they're in this kind of treacherous, snowy, peak, craggy mountain. And at the top of the snowy peak, craggy mountain, you have this kind of, again, that kind of Shangri-La, or like these monks that have mastered stuff at the top, like this, like paradise, right? And obviously that's somewhat of a fallacy, but the idea is like that's the idealization of sport mastery, or even training mastery. And so coaches' jobs is to come back down the mountain, back to the beach, and meet these newcomers and Sherpa them up together, and just provide guidance along the way when needed. Sometimes athletes are going to present information to you where they want you to step away, and a lot of times people are like, a coach may see me doing something like, why aren't you stepping in there? And I'm like, because people learn differently. And so sometimes learning the hard way is a good thing. Like if you think about the journey of stuff, is being able to shortcut and like cheat in a video game, and you get all the way to the top of the mountain, it'll have no meaning. It won't mean much to the individual who shortcutted all of the journey along the way, and it doesn't actually accomplish anything. So it's like, without being unsafe, like I kind of want them to go through the perilous pass, And so the other thing that I try to analogize my business to, which is, the Athletes Online Strength and Conditioning, or TAL Strength and Conditioning, which is like, just means a way, it doesn't mean the way. So I want to give people like empowerment to kind of, have a dialogue with me as their coach and help them reach their goals together. And honestly, not even me, I'm just kind of there to help them get there when they're stuck, and then they can kind of go do their thing until they need me again. And so, another thing that I tried to pull, and something that is special to me, is my dad had a ton of like Native American books and like kind of memorabilia, like as far as like these like arrowheads and all kinds of stuff from his childhood. And he kind of gave it to me, and I had a kind of a fascination with that growing up. And one of the stories, and I think most people know this story, but it's like an old Cherokee wives' tale. It's the tale of two wolves, right? And that goes, an old Cherokee is teaching to his grandson about life. He said, there's a fight going on inside of me, said the boy. And he said, it's a terrible fight. It's between two wolves. One is evil. It's anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, false pride, superiority, and ego, right? And these are all things we all have to deal with in life. And then he said, he continued, the other is good for its joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, compassion, and faith. The same fight is going on inside of you and inside of every other person you run into. And so the grandson, who's like all scared hearing about this story about these two wolves, one good, one evil, is like asks his grandfather which one will win, and then the old grandfather says the one you feed, right? And so to me, it's a mantra about strength and conditioning as well, is because everybody has a choice every day when they wake up to move their body or to go into work mode and do something that's purely mental or purely for themselves or whatever. And so when I say it, feed the wolf, it's me showing some accountability. It's like, hey, like I've had coaches who told me to do something and then didn't do that. Like I had some coaches when I was at UMBC, one of them, he just would give a piece of paper out. And then some of the athletes, when I got there, they would try to do what's called the perfect sit. So they weren't doing anything in the weight room. They wasted their hour. And that really pissed me off because, I had worked too hard at another school, transferred to, not work together as a team. And so like, it was kind of, I took it as my personal mission, like, no, like, come on, get up. Like, we're going to do stuff. Like, even though someone else isn't holding you accountable, like, I'm going to hold you accountable. And then we're going to get better together. And so that positive, even though it's a difficult, kind of uncomfortable feeling, all right, is I think the benefit of strength and conditioning for any team is it makes people comfortable with the uncomfortable to some degree. And it is a mantra that you can repeat in any situation in life. You can take the lessons from the weight room and apply them to other areas of your life that are going to be twice as hard as lifting some weights and doing some jumps and sprints. So that stuff is easy, but people will also forgo that too. So when I try to do something every day, I'm like, hey, I'm doing something, I'm feeding the wolf, and my idea is just always give people a reminder is like, hey, I'm doing it. Hopefully you're doing it too. We can do it together, So that's kind of my shtick behind that. And I don't know if it'll ever take off, but for me, it's always a good mantra. So, and I hope other people can take from it as well. And even if it's just one person, I think that's all that matters.
I feel like all those things that you mentioned are absolutely essential. And as you brought up, the lessons we learn from performance training in the weight room, from training sport and so on that way, they really extend beyond the weight room. I think the first thing to come to mind for me is delayed gratification, that concept of we put the work in now, but don't see the fruits of our labor for months or years later. And I think the more we buy into some of these different concepts that are, indirectly taught through training, the better our overall life becomes. And I think that you and I both agree that that's, ultimately the point of this. It's not just to make someone a great baseball player or a great athlete or, make sure they throw gas. It's also to improve that long-term quality of life, as you talked about. It's, how can we have a good life and a long life and not just a long life? So I love the concept. I really like the chat that we've had today. And I love the way your mind works and thinks around programming and exercise selection and the concept of the animal days. Tim, is there anything that you feel we missed today in our conversation or anything else that you want to close out on?
I think just to add one more thing to that last part we talked about kind of outside the weight room is training is a hygiene. So whether, you would brush your teeth, wash your body in the shower, like obviously you don't always shower 3 times a day, right? Maybe you do when you're busy and you get sweaty multiple times throughout the day, but training is no different. And so just getting that across to everybody, regardless of their skill level at their sport, is my number one objective. And then performance comes secondary to that. And I think if you can instill that internalization in people and who you are and how you periodize or program things, you're basically always fighting either retention or turnover model as a private facility. And I'd much rather take the long retention approach versus just turning over and having new people coming in and out the door all the time. Or transactional is another word you could use for it. So.
Yeah, no, I love that point. I love that point, Tim. For people who want to find out more about you, learn more about your programming, keep up to date with you online, where can they find you at? Are you Instagram guy or TikTok guy? I don't picture you doing the dances for some reason.
No. Although in college they called me Tim Jelly. I was pretty good at dancing and I split my pants at my wedding, but I don't do it on the internet, So, but no, but you can find me on Instagram. It's really simple. It's Tim Kelly SC. So TimKellySC. And then I also have a YouTube channel, which is the Athletes Online SNC. And I have some, exercises on there, obviously, but I also have a few, I call them like shop talks. There's some stuff you can get from there that can get you to understand a little bit more about who I am, the way I think. Then always people are certainly welcome to reach out to me via Instagram on direct messages. and I love talking all things training and life. So I think one last thing to give coaches is diversify your informational source. I think one of the things that has helped me in my career as a strength and conditioning coach is I have a wide variety of interests. I like reading about different science-based stuff like physics and biology and chemistry, but that's only one part of it. I like reading fictional stories. I like, obviously, as you can tell through the podcast, I like other things like martial arts and some of the Eastern philosophy and all that stuff. But I think you can learn from anything. So, if you have interests outside of strength and conditioning, pursue them, because it'll only feed how good you can get at your strength and conditioning profession or physical therapy or sport coaching for that.
Yeah, no, I love that point. I think the more that we learn from each other and expand beyond our horizons, the better off we're going to be. I think that's a great point. We'll link to your social media in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click it there. Tim, really appreciate your time today. Thanks for everything, man.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed talking to you.